Today's passage in the Sermon on the Mount is about judgment. And judgment is on our minds a lot. We often hear phrases like, "Don't judge me," or "Only God can judge me." Sadly, there's a strong sense in the world around us of many that Christians are judgmental, and that makes me grieve because it's, I think, so far from who we're meant to be. Judgment is at the top of our news feeds right now as the nomination and confirmation hearings of a new Supreme Court justice are underway. It's been on our minds a lot. On a personal level, we all know what it feels like to be judged. We know what it feels like to be in that place where someone decides that we don't fit, that we failed, or that we're guilty. And we also know what it's like to be in the position of judgment over another, where in our hearts and sometimes even outwardly we've dismissed them as less than. And so Jesus' words about judgment in Matthew 7, 1 through 5 are very relevant to our lives for many reasons. And in these words, he commands us to walk away from the practice of judgment. He commands us instead to take an inward journey of self-examination rather than focusing on the faults of another. Here's what Jesus says in Matthew 7, 1 through 5. Jesus says, "Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." And Jesus' words begin with a simple statement that are both a command and a warning. Judge not that you be not judged, or in the NIV translation, do not judge, or you too, you will be judged. According to Jesus, there's a correlation between how we live and what we receive. Jesus says that we're not to put ourselves in the place of judgment. And should we choose to, we find ourselves once again being the recipients of judgment, which is a much different place than standing in his grace. Now, Jesus' words are not the same as karma. This isn't his way of saying what goes around comes around. No, he's identifying a spiritual reality. That when we step outside of the context of his grace, when we willfully remove ourselves from the way of life he calls us to, we expose ourselves to that which he came to deliver us from. Jesus, in his words, is saying that we need to take judgment very seriously, and that we also need to take his grace with equal sincerity. And the message I want to share with you this morning is that there are things that are meant for God that are not meant for us. And judgment is one of them. Judgment is meant for God. It's not meant for you, and it's not meant for me. And consider the story of Adam and Eve. Remember their story? They took the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, fruit that wasn't meant for them, fruit that God told them not to eat. And they did it all the same. And when they did, the scriptures say their eyes were open, but their first experience with opened eyes was to feel shame and to hide from God. In a sense, pronouncing judgment upon themselves. And we see as their story unfolds that they open themselves up to something that was meant for God alone. Contained within that knowledge that the fruit gave them was this newfound tendency to place themselves in the role of judgment. And we see that lived out in the lives of their sons, Cain and Abel. When Cain, in his anger and jealousy toward his brother, chose to lead his brother out into the field and pronounce his judgment over him and took his life. Judgment does not belong to us. It belongs to God. And this is what Jesus is saying in Matthew 7, 1 through 5, that judgment is not ours, it's God's. And who among us has the capacity to comprehend the human heart? And yet we find ourselves often standing in a place of judgment over one another. Many of you have heard me share about the emotionally healthy spirituality class we teach here at First Church. And one of the top 10 symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality, according to Pete and Jerry Scazzaro, is our capacity for judging other people's spiritual journeys. Here's what Pete writes. He says, by failing to let others be themselves before God and move at their own pace, we inevitably project onto them our own discomfort with their choice to live life differently than we do. We end up eliminating them in our minds, or we try to make others like us, or we abandon them altogether or fall into a who cares indifference toward them. Like Jesus said, unless I first take the log out of my own eye, knowing that I have huge blind spots, I am dangerous. I must see the extensive damage that sin has done to every part of who I am, emotion, intellect, body, will, and spirit, before I can attempt to remove the speck from the eye of another. Judgment belongs to God. And God looks at the heart where our capacity to fully know one another is limited. Often limited to what's visible on the surface of one's life, but as we all know, there's so much more that makes up a person than what's put on public display. So can you or I, can we truly know the heart of another? That we may to a degree, but even that comes over the course of time and with relational proximity. And let me tell you, it is hard to have relational proximity when there is a log sticking out of your eye. It is hard to be close to people in a real and genuine way when that plank is extending several feet in front of us as we try to draw near to them. Lately, and I've heard this from many people, we've been trained to think that we know the heart of another based on a soundbite or a single response to a question or experience or a post that they put online. We have this feeling that we fully understand that person and where they're coming from and their history and what their perspective is. And when we hear a perspective shared that's not our own, we feel this sense of rage and indignation and judgment boil up within us. But in that moment, do we truly know the person that we're feeling those feelings of judgment towards? Do we truly understand where they are in their journey with God? Do we have the right? Do we have the wisdom and the authority to pronounce them guilty? Some years ago, there was a Christian author who shared an observation in a book he had written. He was at an art display that his church was hosting, and as he strolled through the gallery, admiring the creativity and thoughtfulness of those who had put their work on display, he came across a sculpture that someone had made of Gandhi. And he noticed at the bottom of that sculpture, someone had affixed a sticky note to that sculpture, and on the sticky note had written the words, "Too bad Gandhi is in hell." Now, the author stopped and considered the words that had been written. And he asked internally, how do you know? Do you know? Now, we may have scriptures that lead us to such conclusions, but we have equally powerful scriptures like today's that remind us that these conclusions are not ours to own. Judgment doesn't belong to you, and it doesn't belong to me, and that is some of the best news that we can ever hear. Judgment belongs to God, and God is holy and just and righteous and good and love and patient and wise. In the first service this morning, we sang this beautiful hymn called "There's a Wideness in God's Mercy." And the opening section says this: there's a wideness in God's mercy like the wideness of the sea. There's a kindness in his justice, which is more than liberty. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want another person to be the one who has the final say on my destiny. In fact, I don't even want myself to be the one who has the final say on my destiny. If anyone is going to judge me, I want it to be this God who has a kindness in his justice. And that's not to say that he ignores the faults in my life, but there's a kindness that comes with his justice that he extends to me and to you. And God deals with judgment in a way that blows our limited capacities out of the water. In his grace and his mercy and in his love, he gave us Jesus, our crucified King, to bear the pain and suffering that was intended for us. Judgment, the judgment that we rightly deserve, was placed upon Jesus. and in his love, he bore its weight. And that is God's greatest statement of judgment. His love is so great that he was willing to take what was not meant for him in order to set us free from what we've taken that was not meant for us. Judgment was not meant for Jesus, who was pure, who was without sin, and yet he took it nonetheless. And Jesus' desire in Matthew 7, 1 through 5 is to see us set free from the vicious cycle of judgment. He wants to see us set free from the chains of judgment, and the weight of the chains of judgment is significant. Judgment of the other disrupts our capacity to live in relationship with each other. It disrupts the peace that we're meant to cultivate in our community. It limits our ability to listen, to understand, and to grow. And in the end, we become the victim of our own judgment of others. It tears us apart. It isolates us. It separates us from community, from relationship with God, from relationship with one another. As we've been saying all along, the outcome of living the Sermon on the Mount is to be set free into Jesus' way of kingdom living. And Jesus' way of moving us out of judgment is to practice a lifestyle of examining our own heart, becoming familiar with our own blind spots, prejudices, and sin. And it's working with the Holy Spirit who wants to do this work in our lives to remove those elements from us so that we can see clearly. When I devoted my life to Jesus 25 years ago, that transition was precipitated by a simultaneous recognition of my sin and God's grace. And in that moment, when I poured out my heart before God, there was not a single trace of fixation on the faults of another. I was not thinking about the sins and the wrongdoing of other people, the things that needed to be corrected in their lives. I was focused on owning the weight of my own brokenness. And now that I owned it, handing it off to Jesus, whose hands were extended to me, who was willing to take it, and who had already defeated its power through the cross. And so how and why do we fall into these patterns? I'm confident that it's not the intention of most of us to be judgmental, to put ourselves in that position over another and to view them through that lens. And yet we find ourselves there nonetheless. How do we find ourselves in those places, in those patterns? Let's talk about our insecurities for a moment. I know, it's an exciting topic. You got up this morning and you wanted to come to church and talk about your insecurities. So here we go. I'm giving you a gift. It's not a fun topic to talk about, but it's insightful nonetheless. Insecurity is our uncertainty or anxiety about ourselves. And we feel insecurity for many, many different reasons. Oftentimes, the unhealthy patterns and habits of our family of origin have left a mark on us that flares up in certain circumstances. And our feelings of insecurity in moments like that put us into a self-protective mode. One of the many ways that we might exercise that self-protection is by taking our focus off of ourselves and fixating on the other. If I can look at the faults of another, I don't have to think about the things that are broken within myself. And if we were raised in an environment that was harsh, critical, and made high demands that were often unrealistic, then we may have great difficulty with embracing the reality of God's grace and imparting it to the other. We may feel insecure about God's grace. We may question its sufficiency to cover us, and out of that insecurity, we might feel the need to prove ourselves by doing more, trying to earn our salvation in some distorted way. And we may find ourselves in that same vein beginning to judge others because they don't do enough, or they don't do what we think they should be doing, and in our eyes, they're not good enough, and all the while, we're avoiding the cancer that's present within our own hearts and fixating on something that's not meant for us. And we might gain temporary alleviation from having to engage in that inward journey when we can project on others and fix our attention on their faults. But the problem, as Jesus points out, is that we cause great damage because there's a giant log still sticking out of our eye as we try to relate to the other. And we may even convince ourselves that we're doing our neighbor a good deed by removing their speck. But But the sad reality is that we're inflicting greater damage upon them because we haven't been healed in Jesus' name. And we haven't been invited by God or by that person to speak into their situation. Rather, we're imposing ourselves upon them, trying to fix them, make them in our image, when really they're made in God's image. The journey that Jesus invites us into, it's an inward journey. And as we are healed in his name, he puts opportunities before us to serve as agents of his healing and his grace. But that's different from us choosing out of our own will and our own broken wisdom to insert ourselves where we don't belong. Jesus wants to set us free from the vicious cycle of judgment over others. And as we're freed, he wants to empower us to see and to love the other through his eyes. And so what happens to us when we remove the plank from our eye? Well, we see God with clarity. If you remember some weeks back, we talked about the Beatitudes and how Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." God wants us to see him with clarity, and out of that flows a newfound capacity to see one another with greater clarity, to see one another through the eyes of Jesus. Jesus commands us to remove the plank from our eye. His words aren't soft, they're strong, they're an urgent command compelling us to action. And he doesn't tell us to simply think about the plank in your eye, to contemplate it. He doesn't tell us to carve the plank in our eye and make it decorative, which we do, by the way, when we try to justify our own brokenness and sin so that we don't actually have to face it. We're not removing the plank, we're just messing around with it and trying to spin it in a new way. But there's still a plank sticking out of our eye. And so how does our seeing God clearly change the way we see the other? When I was a seminary student, a professor presented my class with a unique challenge as future pastors, counselors, and teachers. They invited us to see the individuals before us as a composite of all their past stages. So in other words, every human being that's before me was once a child. Depending on their age, was once a teenager. You get the idea. And there were these periods in their lives where they felt the joy and had dreams and hopes and loved to play as a child. And even though the person we might see before us seems very far removed from childhood, somewhere within them is still that child that was created in God's image. Sadly, for many, those same periods of life are also marked by abandonment, disappointment, fear, and abuse. So the invitation was to see others in a different way, to see the whole of the person who's standing before me. Jesus empowers us to see the other as a whole. And isn't that what we notice in his life when we watch the way that Jesus engages with those before him? That he sees a much bigger picture of the person before him than what we see with our limited capacities. The Jewish theologian Martin Buber, in his book I and Thou, describes the two primary ways we relate as an individual to the people and things in the world around us. The first he calls an I-it relationship. It's a relationship where we relate to the other as subject and object, so I'm the subject and the other is the object. Our emphasis is on the function or the task that they perform in relation to us. So for example, the waitress at the restaurant is there to serve me. The mechanic is there to fix my car. The mailman is there to deliver my mail. And my assessment of the individual is one-dimensional, and it's based entirely on my experience, my satisfaction, and the usefulness of the encounter. And there are times where that's simply the way. Cars need to get fixed. Mail needs to be delivered. But the greater truth is that that's not all there is before us. The second way he speaks of, which is especially relevant to us today, he calls the I-thou relationship. It's when this way of relating is profound, and I would argue it's best observed in the way Jesus lived, and it's when the other is a thou, I know them as a whole. To use theological language, we practice the image of God in the other. Their life matters beyond the task they perform. They're not a human doing, they're a human being. They're beloved by God. I'm going to share an example from the scriptures. I go to this example often because it's very helpful. It's a story of the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. And she's thrown on the ground before Jesus. And in this encounter, there's a collision between these two ways of knowing the other. We see some in this story who are relating to her as an I and an it. And we see some in this story, one in this story, who's relating to her as an I and a thou. Here's how the story goes. The scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, brought a woman who'd been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. And so Jesus bends down and begins to write with his finger on the ground. The religious leaders saw this woman as an it. She was guilty. Their law, gave instruction on what they were to do, at least as they understood it. To them, she was simply a pawn in their game to try and trap Jesus. That was her worth and her identity to them. Did they know her name? Did they know anything about her story? Did they know why she was in that situation that they caught her in? Had she chosen to be there, or was she forced to be in that place? Did anything matter to them other than her punishment and her usefulness in dealing with the problem of Jesus? As far as we can tell, no. This is a terrifying example of what it looks like when we assume the role of judge, a role that's not meant for us. Jesus, on the other hand, stoops down and draws close to the woman. He responds to the religious leaders saying, "Let him who is without sin among you cast the first stone." And as you know, they begin to leave one by one. In his words, what does Jesus do? He identifies their sin with her sin. He confronts them with the common humanity that they collectively shared. And after they depart, he stands up and he looks at her. And he says, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." In that moment, Jesus exercises judgment. And because he is God incarnate, he has the authority and the wisdom to do it. He doesn't gloss over her sin. He doesn't ignore it. But he sets her free into a new life. His words are a pronouncement of judgment. And only he knows how to do it right. You and I, we're a lot more like the Pharisees and the scribes, ready to stone a woman who we don't know by name, ready to punish her according to the letter of the law. But Jesus, the one who spoke the law into existence to his people, the one who, as we've learned in the Sermon on the Mount, was the fulfillment of the law, has the power and the authority to release this woman into a new life. That's the one that I want to judge me in the end. What about you? I want the one who sees me completely, who knows me, who wields both holiness, justice, and strength and power, but also love and grace and compassion simultaneously. That's the one that I want to judge me. And when I hear the words of that one saying to me that judgment is not for you, Todd, it's not for you and any of us, I want to be set free from that pattern of living where I judge others, where I put myself in the shoes that belong only to God over the life of another. And it's hard to do, especially in the climate that we live in today. It's so easy to fall into that pattern. But Jesus is saying to us today, I want you to be free from judgment. I want to release you from that, and I want to take back that role because it's my role. It wasn't meant for you. It's not your weight to carry. And you can't carry it the right way. So give it back to me. I'm going to invite the WIN team to come back up, and we're going to continue to worship God together. The incarnation of Jesus brought the fullness of God into physical proximity to humankind. And in Jesus, we see the attributes and the roles of God tangibly expressed. We see and encounter in Jesus the judgment of God. When Jesus says to the blind man, your sins are forgiven, he's carrying out an act of judgment, which is what frustrated so many of the religious leaders who were present at that moment. But he has the right to do so because he is God. And when he says to the woman in our story today, neither do I condemn you, again, he's pronouncing God's judgment over her. But again, he has the right, the authority, and the wisdom and the love to do so. And so as we meditate on his words today, may we be a people who choose to shift our fixation on the faults of others to a lifestyle of self-examination under the careful, loving watch of God. May we be set free from the chains of judgment over one another. And may we entrust that responsibility completely into the hands of God.